Alex Pereira might have one of the most terrifying rises the sport of MMA has ever seen. From working in a tire shop to knocking out champions in multiple divisions, and now potentially being one fight away from becoming one of the greatest fighters of all time. And the craziest part is, he's done it all in just a handful of fights. In just a few years, he's went from a kickboxing world champion to becoming a 2-division UFC champion, knocking out some of the best fighters in the world and putting himself into early GOAT conversations. So, how did he do it? Long before Alex Pereira became a UFC champion, he was working in a tire shop, no hype, no one talking about him, but at the same time he was building something, fighting in kickboxing, developing his skills, and slowly becoming one of the most feared strikers in the world. And during that time, he crossed paths with someone who would go on to become one of the biggest stars the UFC had ever seen, Israel Adesanya. Now, at the time, Adesanya wasn't a UFC superstar that we know of today, but he was already elite, already technical, already ahead of most fighters striking wise. And after both building their kickboxing careers, it was time for them to finally meet. Their first fight was close, extremely competitive, back and forth. Adesanya had success, he was faster, more fluid, more dynamic, but Pereira stayed composed, he stayed patient, and edged out a decision. It was the kind of fight that could have gone either way. Inevitably, this led to a rematch, and the second fight, it was different. This time, Pereira didn't just win, he finished him. A brutal knockout, a perfectly timed left hook in the third round that flatlined Israel Adesanya. Clean, decisive, and one that stuck with Adesanya for years. That moment mattered more than anyone realised at the time, because while Pereira continued his career in kickboxing, Adesanya had already made the move to MMA, and what happened next changed everything. Adesanya didn't just succeed in the UFC, he took over. He built one of the best resumes in the division, defeating fighters like Robert Whittaker, Paulo Costa, Marvin Vettori, and even sharing the cage with Anderson Silva, one of the all-time greats. He outclassed opponents with ease, he made elite fighters look average, and became middleweight champion by dismantling Robert Whittaker. He went on to defend this belt multiple times, he headlined events, he built a massive fan base. At middleweight, he looked simply untouchable. But no matter how dominant he became, there was always one name that followed him: Alex Pereira, the man who had beaten him twice. And Adesanya never ignored it. He spoke about it, he acknowledged it. That loss had stayed with him, and eventually that rivalry pulled Pereira into the UFC. And when Pereira signed, it didn't feel like a normal debut. It felt like the beginning of something, because everybody knew where this was going. They were building towards the Adesanya fight. But first, Pereira had to prove that he belonged in the sport of MMA. His debut came against Andreas Michailidis, and straight away you could see it. He was calm, patient, dangerous. He finished the fight with a flying knee in the second round. Up next came Bruno Silva, a harder test, a dangerous striker with knockout power, but Pereira didn't get drawn into a brawl. He stayed composed, controlled the distance, picked his shots, and won a clear decision. Up next came Sean Strickland. This was different. Strickland was one of the hardest fighters in the division to deal with. Elite defensive striking, constant pressure, a style that was built around breaking opponents down over time. He rarely gets hit clean, he doesn't make big mistakes, but Pereira made it look easy. Just over 2 minutes into the first round, after setting up his shot with body jabs, one clean left hook landed, and Strickland was out cold. That was the moment that people realised that this wasn't just hype, this was real. And suddenly, it was time. He was fighting for the belt against Israel Adesanya, a rematch that oozed tension. This wasn't just another title fight, this was one of the most hyped fights the sport had ever seen. The champion, the superstar, the face of the UFC against the one man who had already beaten him. And there was another factor. Pereira was absolutely massive for middleweight, a huge frame for 185. He was cutting a significant amount of weight just to make the limit. A lot of people believed that this would catch up to him, that over 5 rounds Adesanya would simply take over. And early in this fight, it looked like that might happen. Adesanya had success, he was landing clean, controlling the distance, even rocked Pereira at the end of the first round. On the scorecards, Adesanya was ahead, but Pereira never panicked. He stayed patient, waited for his moment, and in the 5th round, that moment came. He backed Adesanya to the cage, he started landing heavy shots, and the referee had no choice but to step in. Becoming the UFC middleweight champion of the world in just a handful of fights, he had beaten one of the biggest stars the sport had ever seen 3 times now. But the rivalry still wasn't over. Israel Adesanya was not happy about the stoppage, and the rematch was immediate, and the hype was even bigger this time, because now it wasn't just about history, it was about redemption. Adesanya came in different, more aggressive, more willing to take risks, and in the second round, after being backed up himself, looking like history was about to repeat itself, blocking heavy shots up against the cage, he landed a perfectly timed counter right hand, catching Pereira clean and knocking him out. It was a huge moment, a massive comeback, and arguably the biggest win of Adesanya's career. And for the first time, Pereira had been stopped. A lot of people thought that the weight was maybe the issue, that the cut was simply too much, that middleweight was not sustainable. So Pereira made the decision to move up to light heavyweight, and almost immediately he looked better, bigger, stronger, more comfortable. The weight cut was gone, but the power was still there. His first fight at 205 came against Jan Błachowicz, a former champion, a veteran of the sport, and the same man who had previously beaten Israel Adesanya. It wasn't Pereira's flashiest performance, but it mattered, because Jan was strong, experienced, and dangerous in areas that were supposed to trouble Pereira. Wrestling, clinch work, physicality, and even in a close fight, Pereira stayed composed. He landed the cleaner shots, and he got the decision. That win put him straight into title contention and showed that his power and calmness had carried up a division with him. Next came Jiri Prochazka, and this was a huge fight. Jiri wasn't just another contender, he was a former champion, one of the wildest fighters in the sport. He came in with a reputation for pressure and finishing ability, and that's what made this fight so interesting. Jiri is the kind of fighter who drags people into uncomfortable exchanges. He breaks rhythm, he creates chaos, and against most opponents, that works. But Pereira stayed calm. He waited for his openings, he landed the cleaner shots, and stopped Jiri to win the vacant light heavyweight title at UFC 295. In that moment, Pereira became a 2-division UFC champion after only a short run in the sport, and somehow he was still only getting started. Then came UFC 300, one of the biggest events in UFC history, and Pereira was right in the middle of it. Standing across from him was Jamahal, a former champion, a dangerous striker, a confident fighter with real power. Hill had already shown that he could beat elite competition and become champion himself, so this was not supposed to be a walkover. But Pereira made it feel like one. On one of the biggest nights the UFC had ever promoted, he knocked Hill out in the first round and somehow made a title defense on UFC 300 look routine. That win didn't just protect his belt, it made him feel like one of the biggest stars in the entire sport. After that, he fought Jiri again, and by then the first win no longer looked like a one-off, because Pereira beat him again. Another stoppage, another statement. He wasn't just beating elite fighters, he was destroying them. Then there was Khalil Roundtree, a high-level striker with a serious Muay Thai background, heavy kicks, sharp combinations, and early on it was competitive. It wasn't one-sided. Roundtree had success, he landed clean, he had moments where it felt like he could genuinely make this a tough night for Pereira. But as the fight went on, you could feel the shift. Pereira started to find rhythm and enter his flow state. The shots got heavier, more precise, more damaging. And by the later rounds, Roundtree was being pushed back. He was wearing the damage visibly on his face, struggling to keep up with the pressure. And in the fourth round, Pereira closed the show. Another finish, another elite striker broken down over time. Then came Magomed and Ankalaev, and stylistically, this was one of the toughest fights Pereira could have taken. Ankalaev wasn't wild like Jiri. He wasn't going to rush forward or give openings. He was calm, disciplined, well-rounded, a strong grappler, but also a very controlled striker. The kind of fighter who forces you to fight at his pace. And in that first fight, Pereira just didn't look like himself. He was more hesitant, less explosive, not as sharp as we'd seen in his previous performances. Ankalaev was able to control large parts of the fight, mixing grappling threats, slow things down, and take away Pereira's rhythm. And this time, Pereira lost the belt. But after the fight, there were a lot of questions, because almost immediately there were talks that Pereira had not been fully healthy going into that fight. Reports of illness, possible injuries, things that may have affected his performance. And at the time, a lot of people didn't buy it. It's something you often hear in MMA. Fighters lose, and suddenly there's an explanation. So naturally, there was skepticism. But then came the rematch, and this time Pereira looked completely different, sharper, more aggressive, more like the version people had seen during his rise. There was no longer any hesitation, no waiting around, and he came forward with intent and ended the fight quickly. A devastating finish, fast, clinical, decisive, and just like that, he had won the belt back. The difference between the two performances was so clear that it made a lot of people rethink that first fight, because whether it was illness, injury, or just a bad night, this version of Pereira looked like a completely different fighter. And now the conversation around Pereira has gone even further, because he's officially committed to moving up to heavyweight. He's vacated the light heavyweight title and is scheduled to fight Cyril Gane for the interim heavyweight belt at the UFC White House event on June 14th. And if he wins, he would become the first UFC fighter ever to win titles in 3 different weight classes. And that's why we're at a point where the GOAT talk of Alex Pereira has become impossible to ignore. Not because he has the longest UFC career, not because he has the most title defenses, but because almost nobody has done this fast. Former kickboxing champion, UFC middleweight champion, UFC light heavyweight champion, and now potentially one win away from an interim heavyweight title as well. Because if he beats Cyril Gane on a stage as big as the White House card, then you're no longer just talking about a great run. You're talking about one of the most unique and arguably one of the most impressive combat sports careers that we have ever seen. So the question is, how far can Alex Pereira still go? If he keeps winning, at what point do we stop calling this a legendary run and acknowledge him as one of the greatest fighters of all time?